Bonjour. Bonjour, everyone. Nata no kikwa dijnakaz, kikwanan dunjiba, mijika dodam anishnave kwandao. I just introduced myself to you in the Ojibwe language. My name is Hardworking Woman, also known in English as Christy Brissette. And I'm honored to serve Western's learning community as the newly appointed Vice Provost and Associate Vice President for Indigenous Initiatives. So the Office of Indigenous Initiatives is responsible for championing Indigenous strategic initiatives, building collaborative and community engaged partnerships, and supporting campus partners in implementing Western's Indigenous strategic plan. So I'm joining you today from my home community, Kikonan, Minwa Ajunada, so Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And this is the traditional territory of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I also acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. So this land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples such as the First Nation, the Métis, and the Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. So on behalf of the Western community, I wish to acknowledge and welcome every one of you to this very special event to discuss the work of embedding anti-racism and decolonization in university approaches to EDI, equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And your support and your participation within this work to identify, mitigate, and address systemic barriers within academia and in research ecosystems is paramount. I just wish to acknowledge that when we close out our meeting today, we will be calling upon our elder Myrna Kicknosway from the territory of Bikezunan to close us out today in a good way. And so I do thank Myrna for her participation with us today, and I know that when we hear from her at the end of our session, she will ensure that we are grounded as we leave and reflect on the good things we talked about today. So as we get started, I am delighted to acknowledge that today's special event is the result of extensive and ongoing collaboration at Western and abroad. And I wish to acknowledge the following. So Dr. Nicole Kaniki and Dr. Bertha Garcia, who are Western's special advisors to President Alan Shepard on anti-racism. Also together with Candace Brunette-Debassige, who is Western's special advisor to the Provost on Indigenous initiatives, and I acknowledge them for their collaboration and for their partnership. I would now like to call upon Dr. Bertha Garcia and Nicole Kaniki. Dr. Nicole Kaniki, who I understand will open our event with an outline of the work to reimagine the current processes for EDI initiatives at Western, and also to address how their work will activate the recommendations of the report to the President's Anti-Racism Working Group, and for them to introduce today's special feature speakers, Dr. Malinda S. Smith and Dr. Sheila Cote-Meeks, who will help situate our discussion today within the national context and share their knowledge and experience as prominent EDI leaders. So miigwech to you all for your participation and for your collaboration in this work.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bertha Garcia, and with Nicole Kaniki, we are President Shepard's special advisors on EDI. Since our appointment in August last year, Nicole and I have been impressed by the widespread and targeted EDI initiatives throughout our campus. Our EDI network now exceeds 50 groups and units. There is great momentum to affect real change. And with the impending appointment of a new AVP EDI and an EDI Advisory Council, we are optimistic of what the future holds at Western. I have now the pleasure to introduce our two distinguished panelists. Each panelist will address us for approximately 15 minutes. Immediately following, a panel discussion will be taking place, which will be facilitated by Nicole Kaniki and Candace Brunette. Our first speaker is Dr. Sheila Cote-Meeks. Dr. Sheila Cote-Meeks is an Anishinaabe from the Tem Augama Anishinaabe and is Vice President, Equity, People, and Culture at York University. She is the former Associate Vice President, Academic and Indigenous Programs at Laurentian University. A leader in Indigenous education, Dr. Cote-Meeks has focused on bringing about systemic changes that attend to equity, diversity, and inclusion in post-secondary educations. Following Dr. Cote's presentation, Dr. Malinda Smith will address our group. Dr. Malinda Smith is a Canadian political scientist. She's the inaugural Vice Provost of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. Previously, she was a professor of political science at the University of Alberta, where she was also a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow and a Provost Fellow in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She specializes in diversity and intersectionality studies, particularly as they are practiced in higher education institutions, as well as African security studies and international inequality. So, Dr. Cote, welcome.
Miigwech, thank you, Bertha, for the introduction. So bonjour, kwekwe, samakwe dijnakas, makwadodem, temiagama Anishinaabe. Warm greetings to everyone. My traditional name is Tobacco Woman. I come from the Bear Clan and I come from the people of the Deep Water. I also want to just acknowledge that I'm currently located on the traditional territory of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabe, located in Niswakmak, otherwise known as Sudbury, Ontario. I want to just also acknowledge the organizers of today's event and just thank them for the kind invitation to join Dr. Malinda Smith here today as a fellow panelist to bring some perspectives and thoughts about our work in higher ed. So I'll get started. I want to start with a quote on the importance of leadership, because I really think it's important when we're having these discussions to understand and context some of the work that we're doing. So quote by Strum in 2006 on Leadership Matters. The provost says, I don't have the power, it's the deans. The deans say, I don't have the power, it's the chairs. The chairs say, I don't have the power, it's the faculty. And the faculty says, there is no leadership on this issue. And so too often, more times than I care to imagine or remember, I often heard many of the same kinds of sayings. And so it's difficult and challenging to bring about change when people feel like that they don't have the ability to bring about change. So leadership matters throughout the organization, and leadership is required if one aspires to embed any anti-racism or decolonizing practices within an institution. So I'll come back to leadership closer to the end of my my brief remarks, but I'm going to focus on three specific areas. One is I always like to start when I'm writing papers or starting talks, is to have some kind of what do you call that? I need to set the stage or a context. And one of the ways that I thought I would do it for this talk was to provide some definitions so that people in the audience have an understanding about, how I situate my work, but also how I define things like EDI, anti-racism, and decolonization. The second thing I wanted to briefly touch upon was I thought I'd share some thoughts about Indigenous peoples relative to the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then the third piece is around how we can start mobilizing systemic change around EDI, anti-racism, and decolonization in the universities and in higher ed. So I'll start with briefly with some definitions. I'll start with the equity, diversity, and inclusion ones. So just generally, and there's various ways that people define these, but equity really is about a process of creating equivalent outcomes for members that have been historically underrepresented and or oppressed individuals and groups. In Canada, these are 4 federally recognized groups of people that include women, racialized people, Aboriginal persons, and persons with disabilities. And some organizations also recognize persons who identify as LGBTQ2S community. And at its crux, equity is really about ensuring there's some fairness in terms of the way that we treat people. Diversity is about a group and really does focus around relationships, but here I refer to Shirk's definition that identifies the differences in race, color, place of origin, religion, etc. And we can have a diversity of perspectives and experiences. Inclusion is when traditionally marginalized groups, the groups that I talked about in the first part around equity, actually feel like they have a sense of belonging and inclusion. So, for instance, on our campuses, and they feel comfortable and empowered to participate in anything that the organization or the university is putting on. So, for example, different events and so forth, but also that they're treated equitably while they're on our campuses. The 3 concepts around EDI, of course, are interrelated and work in tandem with one another. So, for example, it would be difficult, I think, to achieve diversity without ensuring that there's attention to equitable hiring practices, for example. So generally, EDI work is about removing systemic barriers that may impede an individual or group of people's ability to fully participate in society. And then the 2 other definitions that I wanted to touch upon were around anti-racism and decolonization. So anti-racism is work that's actively opposing racism by, through advocacy for changes to political, economic, and social life. It tends oftentimes to focus on an individualized approach, but it can focus more broadly on groups. But basically, it's that actively opposing racism. That's very simplified, but just as a starting point. Decolonization. When I think about decolonization, I usually try to deconstruct the word, which is de and colonization. So I'm going to start with colonization in the first instance. And when I did my doctoral work, and also in the book Colonized Classrooms, I defined colonization as having 4 specific elements. The first being that colonization was always about the land and the resources, and the exploitation of the land and the resources in any country, but obviously in Canada. In order for lands to be appropriated, there had to be a specific kind of mindset or view of the Indigenous people of the land. And I identified that as being having its origins in racist ideology that reduced Indigenous people to places of inferiority. The third component of defining colonization is around the amount of violence that colonization enacts in order to proceed. And the fourth one is that for Indigenous people and people in this country, as well as many places around the world, colonization remains ongoing, and it's not really a thing of the past. So when I think about decolonization, then in my view, and when we talk about decolonization, we're talking about addressing those four aspects. And I just quote from Tuck and Wang Yang that decolonization really doesn't have a synonym. So it's not really a substitute, in other words, for human rights or social justice, but they are interconnected in many ways. So I'll leave the definitions there for a moment, and I'll turn now to Indigenous people vis-a-vis equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I know that there's been ongoing discussions with colleagues in different parts of Canada and around, the kind of proliferation, I guess, of EDI offices, positions like myself, as a VP of Equity, People and Culture, positions like Dr. Malinda Smith. And in a lot of instances, the Indigenous portfolio, people have been questioning whether or not they belong under the EDI umbrella or they stand alone, and so forth. So I hope that we would be able to have some more conversations about this, because I think it's still one that we're still working at unpacking. But I think it's important to think about a couple of things when we're doing that unpacking. And one is that Indigenous nations and peoples have been, there's no doubt, have been historically marginalized and underrepresented in Canada, and in employment, in education, and so forth. And so practices like EDI policies can actually be useful in assisting with addressing some of these systemic inequities in the system. But it's important also to understand that Indigenous nations and peoples also have a very unique positionality in this country, and that is that their connection to the land, which, if you recall my definition around decolonization, the piece about the land is critical to understanding decolonization, and that tie to the land is important. And in my previous work in colonized classrooms, I talk about this point around how colonization continues to advance. And as it continues to advance, it's Indigenous peoples of the land that are the most threatening to the advancement of colonization, because they have real ties and claims to the land in this country. And then a third point around this is to think about that Indigenous peoples here view themselves as First Nations, so that they are nations and have sovereignty. So when we're unpacking where Indigenous portfolios fit, say for instance within an EDI portfolio, it's important to think through that in a much deeper way. So a couple more things. I know that time goes by quick when we're only asked to talk for 15 minutes, and I'm cognizant of that. But I wanted just to touch upon about what universities can be doing to embed anti-racism or decolonizing practices within the whole EDI portfolio. And I think what I always think about is, first and foremost, is that at the core of a lot of the work that we do is about relationships and building relationships. working with people. And I think in any kind of EDI work, whether you're doing decolonizing work, you're working to bring about changes so that people feel like they have a strong sense of belonging, that we need to recognize the time it takes to do this work. It doesn't happen just overnight. And it does take a lot of relationship building, oftentimes as well, EDI offices or Indigenous lead offices are usually very small and not fully funded in the way that some other offices might be. And so there's a lot of pressure on EDI offices to bring about huge kind of what we call transformative changes within an institution. So it does require at its core building relationships across various groups of people right across campus. And some of the things to think about when you're trying to mobilize change is to think about, that the change that's needed to address the inequities and the systemic barriers that exist in the system require a kind of an about face, if you will, change to the institutional culture. And it will and does affect the entire institution. It should be intentional. Meaning that we make intentional objectives that we're going to undertake, and that we know it'll take time to do that. And that transformation also requires the support, I think, especially of senior administrative support. It's that whole quote at the very beginning when I started talking, is that leadership matters. And if senior administrative support is there, it's much more likely that the changes will be taken up, but also hopefully over time be embedded within the institution and help shift the institutional culture. It also requires collaborative leadership. A lot of that's related to this whole notion around building relationships, having an ability to have a vision of what it is that you want to accomplish, and ensuring that faculty and staff development is in place so that the burden of responsibility doesn't just rest with the EDI office, but proliferates out in the rest of the institution. And of course, it always has to be followed by a very visible action. I have a few other thoughts on this, but I'll hold them until we have our Q&A, and I really look forward to that discussion. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Malinda Smith. Malinda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheila Cote-Meeks. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. Before I make a few remarks, I would like to acknowledge that I'm here in Calgary, which is the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and that the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I do this actually in opening most meetings at the university, in large part because I want to acknowledge that we do this work around equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization, in the context of contestations around land, around place, around territory, but also in institutions deeply haunted by dispossession, institutions that were often built without many of us who inhabit it in mind. And I think that's also an instructive way to think about how we think about the discursive and conceptual universe of equity, diversity, inclusion. Diversity from what, and inclusion into what? And we often talk about intercolonial structures. So I also want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to participate with my colleague, Dr. Cote-Meeks. So much appreciation. The title of this webinar is Embedding Anti-Racism Decolonization into University Approaches to EDI. That's actually very instructive because so I want to make 3 or 4 broad points. The first of which is we are now having a deep discussion in Canada about anti-racism. But I also want to remind us that we've had similar kinds of conversations over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. At the time, often reframed in terms of race relations. It was part of the university discourses. There were multiple task force in the late 80s and 1990s. And many scholars, renowned scholars, were taking up this mantle of racism. It disappeared. And I argue that it disappeared in the late 90s, 2000, or right around the time of the Durban Declaration on anti-racism. But I'll return to this. Its recent reemergence in the aftermath of the racial reckoning in the spring and summer in 2020 gave rise to numerous anti-racism statements from university leaders. Many of them went on listening and learning tours. Anti-racism initiatives have emerged, particularly anti-Black racism initiatives. And all of this, implicit in all of this, these recent initiatives, is the recognition that for the past 3 decades of employment equity, anti-racism was not a central feature, nor was racial equity. So that's an important point. So this admission is no coincidence that it followed the aftermath, as I said, of the 9/11, but also the Durban Declaration. So only now are we attending to things like race equity. Only now are we attending to disability justice. Only now are we partly incorporating LGBTQ2+ discussions. We don't even yet have a proper framing or strategies for each of these kinds of dimensions, which tells us then something about employment equity and what is happening to equity and EDI. So the second point I want to acknowledge then is that in Canadian universities, since the 1980s, employment equity and EDI has largely been about gender equity. Now, I don't say this to say that gender equity has succeeded. I say this to say that we need to be mindful about when most institutions use that language or rubric, it means one equity group. We can ask questions about why universities excluded racialized visible minorities, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities. We can ask why the infrastructures that they have established around data collection, around EDI offices, around EDI literacy, the default is gender equity. We must ask those questions because now that we are talking about inclusion more broadly, this is seen by some as reverse discrimination. This is seen by some as exclusion as a zero-sum game, which tells us we don't have yet the conceptual framework to understand that EDI has always already been about a much bigger tent than it came to be. So I want to stress then that when we talk about race, anti-racism, we need to be talking about racial equity. We need to understand the history and contemporary experiences of racial injustice, about colonialism in Canada and slavery in Canada, and different forms of oppression and dispossession. We need to understand the structural roots of racial inequality. We need to understand data about race and racial disparities and why they exist and why they persist, and how data can be used actually to help us address those questions. We need to understand, name the problem of race and racial inequity in order to address the problem. And as Sarah Ahmed put it, those who name the problem can't be depicted as the problem. And finally, we need to be proactive in creating a vision of racial inclusion and racial justice as part of a commitment to an equitable, diverse, inclusive, and decolonial universities. I want to make a point about Indigenous, as Dr. Cote-Meeks raised. Indigenous has always been part of equity, but it was not taken up despite the Royal Commission on Indigenous Peoples, despite many reports on Indigenous peoples. It started to be taken up in the context of the TRC's 94 calls to action. And so I like to use the framework by Adam Gaudry and Danielle Lawrence around how we think about indigenization, one as inclusion, so in a way similar to the equity kinds of initiatives. Another is reconciliation, indigenization. Another is decolonial indigenization, or what Dr. Cote-Meeks was talking about in terms of land and place and ceremonies, and how that's actually a difference that makes a difference in how we think about EDI more broadly. And I'd also like to make a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Michael Hart, who is the Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement at University of Calgary, because we have these conversations about how and why we intersect, but also how we differ. This leads to the question of decolonization and decolonialism. It's really important to note that there is, in Canada and elsewhere, this whole conversation, we need to decolonize, not diversify. And these things are pitted as either or. And that the claim is that EDI is a framework, a conceptual framework, which is not able to deal with structural and systemic change. It has failed to do so. And we need something much bigger. But my view is whatever language we use, equity, diversity, inclusion, indigenization, reconciliation, social justice, all of these concepts are open to appropriation and to misuse. And we actually must fight. Part of the struggle is about fighting around the language and who gets to name them and how we understand them, and also gets to shape what they do. So decolonization is really important for us to think about, and especially in terms of embedding it in universities. It's much bigger than universities, but that means we must understand the role that universities played in the architecture of colonialism, in the architecture of slavery, in the architecture of oppression. These are not just liberal institutions. These were institutions that were part and parcel of imperialism and colonialism. That's why we have questions around Rhodes Must Fall, around the language of Ryerson or McGill or Lord Dalhousie or Amherst or Colston. That's why there's a whole discussion around these statues must fall, because in large part, they are also about the ways in which even the construction of universities on indigenous land, the dispossession, was part and parcel of the creation of these institutions of higher education. So I'll just make a few final comments in closing this out. Anti-racism and anti-colonialism, as Dr. Cote-Meeks has pointed out, have always been inextricably connected, because they have always been about oppression. They've always been about constituting the other, the non-European, as lesser than, as inferior, the knowledges as inferior, their ways, their cultures, languages as inferior. So decolonization then is fundamentally about unsettling and transforming conditions of colonial rule, domination, and systems, the coloniality of power, colonial ideologies of superiority. It's about dismantling structures and systems that reproduce them, the unequal relationships that Dr. Cote-Meeks was talking about. It's about transforming governance and leadership. It's about transforming teaching and learning, not just the curriculum, which is mostly in social science and humanities, drawn from 6 countries in Europe, the West, kind of ethnocentric, ethno-cultural literatures and languages, globalized to the rest of the world. So that the core curriculums in most social science and humanities are really drawn from Europe. So that's why questions around indigenization, questions around Africanizing the curriculum, questions around unsettling Bantu education is actually about the ways in which the colonial powers have actually shaped what it is we know, how we know it, and how we think about knowledge. It's also about knowledge and archives, the archives we've inherited, about the library holdings. It's also about research and scholarships, which questions we ask, which methodologies we are able to use. It's about community engagement, which communities matter, how we engage them, how we think about communities' engagement, and how we value it even in our university structures. It's about redefining the architecture of the universities, the sports teams' names, the symbols and ceremonies, the names of the buildings. And I give these examples of decolonizing the university as a way of saying this is actually a very difficult project. And it requires thinking about it as a journey and a difficult journey, because we are unsettling relations of power and domination. So while these words may be appropriated as buzzwords, let there be no illusion about the difficult task ahead. And back to the point of diversity, we don't even have a seat at the table. We are underrepresented, we are marginalized, So this fight or contestation around cluster hirings, this contestation around inclusion actually matters, because you actually need to be a part of the institution in order to transform it. And it asks questions about what would be like in its place. And to me, that's the bigger imaginary, right? What do we do once we have unsettled? When we transform it, what would it look like? I would argue it looks like a more equitable, a more diverse, a more inclusive, and a more decolonial university. How we get there, that's where the contestations occur. In my view, this is the moment we are in, and we cannot turn away from the need for this. This is a question of justice. This is a question of fairness. And I think we all must be a part of that project. And so I would only say this: those who attend this workshop, if we don't have university presidents and vice presidents and provosts and board governors and senators at these meetings, that's part of the challenge we face. They must be part of these conversations, not just those of us who experience these things at the margins. They must be part of this conversation. They must be part of shaping it. So the tables that they attend are not exclusionary, because those tables are shaped by whiteness, hegemonic whiteness, we know in university leadership. So how do we close that gap? I actually think that's the challenge we face. But Dr. Cote-Meeks is right. Leadership matters. And I would say a more diverse, equitable, inclusive leadership matters. Thank you very much.
Miigwech, Chi Miigwech, thank you for your words, for your vision, for your courageous leadership. My name is Candace Brunette-Debassige, and I'm the special advisor to the provost here at Western Indigenous Initiatives. And I'm a Cree woman originally from Treaty 9 territory, and I have the privilege of working here at Western. I'm joined here today with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Nicole Kaniki, and we're going to be moderating this next portion of the question and answer period. So I'm going to hand it over to Nicole to ask the first question.
Thank you, Candace. And I am just overwhelmed by the wisdom and just everything that we just received. Thank you so much, Dr. Cote-Meeks and Dr. Smith, for honoring us in this way at Western. So much of everything that you have just provided with us, I think, resonates, especially for the ongoing conversations that we are having at our institution at the moment. And we really appreciate all of this. So I'm just going to go right into our first question. I think both of you have touched on this in your discussions, and I just, Candace and I also had a discussion before this discussion about exactly a lot of the things that you talked about. So, you know, as I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you speak, my fingers are snapping and my eyes are closed because I'm just receiving it all. Thank you so much. So for the first question I would like to ask, Dr. Smith, you spoke a little bit about sort of the historic, like we've been at this point before. We've been at this point before where institutions have realized, academic institutions have realized, we need to be thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our question to you today is in the, where we are at today. So, our question really was in the last decade, but I think, we're in a moment where it's been in this past year, even it's changed so much from just a year ago or 2 years ago, that we find ourselves at a moment, as you said, Dr. Smith, in this work, in this equity, diversity, decolonization, and indigenization work. Our question to you is, and I will ask perhaps Dr. Cote-Meeks, if you can speak to this first, is how have universities approached this shift over the past decade? How have you seen it sort of shift? And even, in the past year, with so many new positions being formulated, new structures being developed at institutions, Western is going through that process right now as we're in the process of seeking our Associate Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. What has the shift been in this work that you've seen over the past decade?
I'm going to come at it from, I'll say a couple of things. One is that I think EDI work has been around for quite a while. in the institution. You know, I've been working in post-secondary education now, yikes, 31 plus years. Probably giving away my age, but and you know, I remember when I first started working at the university, there was, I think, an equity officer, one person. I mean, given relative to the university, it was rather small, but still, there wasn't a lot of attention given to equity, even though it was still part of the university. And I think, like Malinda had pointed out earlier, a lot of the equity was focused on gender. There was not really a lot of focus on Indigenous or other racialized groups or persons with disability. There was some, but it was heavily focused around gender and gender equity. And you know, fast forward, you know, to what you were trying to keep us contained into the 10-year period. I think a lot of the work that happened in 2010 through to the release of the Truth and Reconciliation report in 2015, and then post, there was a lot of work done around addressing the inequities for Indigenous people in post-secondary education. And I see a lot of work. There was a lot of work, a big driver for that. There's still lots of work to be done. And now we've come to another point in time due to a series of events that happened last spring that highlighted deaths and violence in both Black and Indigenous communities here in Canada, but also in the US, that's led us to responding in a very real way to issues around anti-Black racism, for example. And so you see these kind of moments in time where it seems like society, people that are working in the institution are almost in a state of readiness to want to act. And it's really sad in a lot of ways that a lot of violence has to happen for that to happen. But so what have I seen over the last 10 years, last decade, is I've seen an increase of awareness around EDI, around decolonization and anti-racism, and the need for institutions to start addressing that in real ways. But I still also recognize that it has to be more than lip service. There has to be actionable things that come out of these moments that we seem to experience as society. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Dr. Smith.
So what I would say is, yes, over the since what we've been referring to as the moments of racial reckoning, the spring and summer following the death of George Floyd, but also Paquette Korchinski. You could think about the experiences of 3 women now dying in Quebec hospitals. We can think of the violence around the police. All of these things highlight the role of institutions, right? But if you look at the Supreme Court of Canada, so I'm going to give you this broad example to say why the universities are not are important. You know, the Supreme Court of Canada, the justice system, predominantly characterized by a judiciary of whiteness. If you think about corporate boards, characterized similarly. You think about nonprofit sector, characterized similarly. All the recent research, including the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University, but also the Stats Canada, highlight that leadership and governance and leadership structures, all the major institutions that matter, financial, legal, political, are overdetermined by systemic whiteness, right? So that begs the question, and universities are no different. Universities Canada report suggests only 8% of the leadership in universities are racialized. Very modest. Most deans, you can count them on maybe one hand who are Indigenous, and a smaller group who are racialized. That means, I want us to think about this, that means that the very people who are making decisions about these kinds of issues, racial justice, reconciliation, disability justice, the people who are making decisions about them are often doing so about us, but not with us. And so that's changing. The insistence now that the principle should be not about us, without us, and that we have inherited from Indigenous struggles. But the second thing is then, I want us to think about the table of decision-making and why we must change those. The seat at the table doesn't necessarily mean, and voice at the table doesn't mean power and influence, but without it, we are still being objects of knowledge. We're still being on the menu rather than the chef. So we need to change the leadership structure. We need to change the governance structures. These universities were designed without us in mind. So we need to redesign them. And that is hard work, changing systems of selection from everything from directors to chairs to university leaderships, changing processes, changing hiring practices to be much more inclusive. That's hard. I think in the research ecosystem, the CRC program, Dimensions EDI have actually helped to ignite change there. We need something similar in the teaching and learning. And actually, I think indigenization efforts have helped to broaden this discussion around changing the curriculum. So we need bodies and bodies of knowledge. So we need cluster hires. And that's why those initiatives are really important. We need to see new postdocs, and that's why the new postdocs at York University, at McGill, at University of Toronto, at Queen's University, these are all important. New research chairs around which we can build and reinforce bodies of knowledge and different ways of knowing. But the EDI infrastructures are, as Dr. Cote-Meeks pointed out, are small, they are puny. They are puny relative to the size of the task that they face. And this is a serious question. When things matter in universities, the resources are put towards effecting change. And can one EDI advisor in a tiny office that has a reporting structure that goes exactly where? Can one person, or even two or three, change, be the change that's necessary in institutions? So I want us to have a serious discussion around EDI infrastructure and a serious discussion around EDI literacy. And the value of the TRC and indigenization initiatives is that they have shown that communities matter to actually holding universities accountable and also holding those who hold those positions accountable. And the final point I'll make, and I'm talking too long here, is that many of these roles that have emerged, new anti-racism advisors, new AVPs, Indigenous, new AVPs and VPs and vice provosts, EDI. I am very mindful that many of these positions include people like us, racialized and Indigenous peoples. I am also very mindful that we are entering these positions precisely at a moment when people are fed up. They're tired of statements, they're tired of talk, and they want action. And then we are unavoidably part of the lightning rod against which critiques are hurled. Because we are now the face for institutions that are non-performative around EDI and indigenization. So we have a particular obligation to speak truth to power, including the power structures that we are part of. But I won't say this is an easy work, and I would say that without communities, this work would be even harder. So I am grateful to students who have been the change, who have pushed all of us to think about classrooms, about hiring, about leadership, and about being better at what we are doing. So much of this is ignited by Black Lives Matter, but also by student mobilization. So students are the change we've actually been long waiting for.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for that. And I definitely echo your last comment about students. And And I know even for Western as well, even in the work that allowed us to begin this work, it was the voices of students that brought it to the table for discussion. So I definitely echo in that. And I'll leave it over to Candace for the next question.
Thank you. I love also the nod to students and communities. I know that Indigenous communities have really supported mobilizing the work on the Indigenous front. I'm just curious if maybe both of you could speak to the role of these new EDI offices, which you both head up as senior leaders in your institutions, the role that you feel they play in helping educate our campuses on this language, maybe the different philosophies that we're taking to EDI today, and kind of helping people understand some of the pitfalls around the appropriation, co-optation that can often happen with the terminology. I'm really curious about how you see that happening, how that takes place, the co-optation and appropriation of the terms, or how they kind of slide into these different maybe unintended meanings, and how you in your leadership role help to educate and facilitate the right meanings, I guess, that we're trying to see and transform at our institutions. Maybe I will begin with Sheila, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Candace. Yeah, I think as I started my talk around terminology, I think terminology really matters. And I think we do need to take the time to unpack some of these concepts so that people do have an understanding of them. And I know at York University, the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion often provides different kinds of workshops that talk about some of the terminology that's used in EDI work. For instance, like unconscious bias is another term that's often utilized in terms of hiring. But so, yeah, but I think too that there is also kind of a tendency in institutions to, I want to say, like once you have an EDI office in place, whether it's called the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion, or whatever it's called, that there's so much responsibility put on that one office to be all things and doing all things related to EDI that makes it really challenging. And so I think it in some ways it's unintended, and in other times it is intended. It's kind of like that, you're kind of like in this kind of slippery slope area, but where you want to champion and lead EDI practices, decolonization work, but at the same time, it needs to be taken up across the institution. So it's beyond terminology, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Terminology is a starting place, and getting people kind of on that level playing field so that they understand what the terminology is. But the real work is getting people on board to make change and be visible and be intentional about the changes that they're making. And then, and then the other piece of that is ensuring that we embed systemic change within the system. Otherwise, all this work, all this effort could get lost fairly quickly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cote-Meeks. How about you, Dr. Malinda Smith? Do you have anything to add on to that question?
I agree with Dr. Cote-Meeks, and I was delighted that she started with this, the important discussion around conceptual clarity. I think because how we name a problem also helps us to think about how we address the problem, and whether we leave things unnamed. So, for example, I point out that often race is unnamed, racism is unnamed, and if you can't name the problem, you can't address the problem. But equity, my view is, with equity work, we sometimes misunderstand the why. We misunderstand that this is fundamentally, as Wisdom T put it, this is not just about equity seeking, i.e. we are seeking equity or inclusion, and as Dion Brown said, into what? Rather, it's to say we are deserving of it, because all of us deserve justice and fairness. And when I think of equity, I always invite people to think about when we defer equity to the future, or we engage in equity detours, we are saying that some people in this moment aren't deserving of fairness, aren't deserving of a fair, equitable playing field. We can defer it to the future. Now, for whom do we defer justice to the future? You cannot value human life, human rights, human dignity, and say, oh, Black people, we defer equity for you to the future. It's too expensive right now. We can't think about you right now. Or when we say, oh, LGBTQ, we're going to defer it to the future. Let's come and visit us in 10 years. So we need to remember that equity is always about fairness, about justice, about doing the right thing. And that's always the right thing to do. Diversity, my view, is a slippery language, and university uses it in so many ways that lead to kind of non-conformity. But just to say, we use it to talk about people. My view is if you have a more equitable university, yes, there will be there'll be a greater diversity of people. But you need to create the equitable pathways for that to happen. Equitable processes, equitable hiring practices, equitable classroom admissions policies to make sure we have diversity. But universities often don't use diversity to refer to people. They use diversity to refer to perspectives, perspectival diversity, heuristic diversity. They use it to refer to diversity of the university in a broad, non-specific sense to say, oh, diverse disciplines, diverse faculties, diverse methodologies, diverse and so diversity for me cannot do the work of equity. And again, to reiterate what Dr. Cote-Meeks said at the opening, inclusion is fundamentally a qualitative experience about belonging. Who belongs? You can invite people, as Myrna Maya said, to the party, but do they sit on the sidelines, or do you invite them to dance? The act of inviting is an act of power. Who gets to invite? Who has the resources to invite? When is it the moment that Dr. Cote-Meeks and I get to invite, or you get to invite? How often is that? So I think the language of EDI, to the extent that it has largely not produced a more equitable academy, has come into disrepute and is facing significant criticism. And my view is, if it deserves criticism, it should get the criticism. It must be better. But we need to have a consensus within our universities and our colleges and CJEPs about what this language means, and never lose sight about the question of why we are doing it. We are doing it because it's the fair thing to do, and the fair thing to do is the right thing to do, and it cannot be deferred to the future, a future that might never arrive. So how we do that, the resources to do it, that's a whole nother cup of tea. And whether it's provided there, the infrastructure is provided to enable that to happen. If it is not provided, how serious are institutions about affecting change? And we haven't even gotten to decolonization yet, because that requires a massive energy to redesign universities in ways that have all of us in mind.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Nicole.
Thank you for that, Dr. Smith. And I see exactly, like, in this work, when words get taken up, or when, the language of EDI is being used, who is actually contributing even to that conversation of, do we use the words EDI? Do we use the words EDID? Who is part of that conversation? And do we understand what decolonization means? Because when we add that D, do we have the commitment to actually decolonizing when we're saying that that's what we're going to use as part of the work that we do? Such great points there. Thank you. So in the next question, I kind of want to go off something that has been also part of the discussions. Dr. Cote-Meeks, you mentioned earlier as well about the importance of leadership. Dr. Smith, you also emphasized this, the role of leaders in this process. And Dr. Cote-Meeks, I really appreciated your reference to the provost says it's the work of the deans. The dean says it's the work of the the department heads. The department head says, I love that reference. I'm going to definitely be keeping that in my work as a perfect visual as to what happens at the institution when these discussions need to be happening about whose responsibility it is. And so, this was really emphasized in how important leadership is and the role and responsibility for this work. One of the questions that we do have from our audience is, what is the role of student organizations in this work? So I know we've spoken to a lot about the roles and responsibilities of leadership, but we do have someone from the asking if the panelists can speak to what the role of student government organizations are in pursuing more equitable, diverse, and inclusive post-secondary campuses. So how can students participate in this process? I'll let Dr. Cote-Meeks, if we're kind of going in that circle, Dr. Cote-Meeks, and then Dr. Smith, if you can comment as well then.
Thanks, Nicole. And I think it's back to that whole thing that Malinda said earlier, which is that students are actually driving a lot of the change on campuses across the country. And honestly, it's really fantastic to see, I guess, to see them take up their place in the institution and to drive the changes that they need to see for the future. When I think about, like, when I worked specifically in the Indigenous portfolio, it was actually students that pushed the Senate at an institution to make changes to get Indigenous leadership into senior administration. They were the ones that wanted different services. They wanted to see themselves reflected in the institution. And so, in terms of drivers of change, they actually drive a lot of change. And I get a little distressed when students give up their ability to drive that change, because sometimes they step back and feel like they can't change a system, right? Or that they don't have any power in the system. But when they do recognize how much that they actually do have, it's actually quite incredible to see. And I just finished a round of consultations with Black faculty, staff, and students at our institution. And I have to say that it was the Black students that were the most vocal. And sometimes it's challenging, right, as an administrator to hear, what they've been experiencing, because they will talk very freely about the racism that they experience in the system. And as an administrator who's responsible for the EDI portfolio, it's distressing to hear that, and all the different ways that racism manifests itself on our campuses and in society. And when you're trying to build more inclusive environments, that's sometimes difficult for people to hear. But I heard you hear the same thing from, or not the same, I shouldn't say the same, but similar narratives, similar stories from Indigenous students and their experiences. But I think, in terms of their role, one of their significant role is to drive the change, that needs to happen on these institutions. And, they do have firsthand experiences that, most of them are not afraid to talk about. And we need to really listen to them, because they're on the ground, they're telling us what's going on, and we can identify where we need to make some significant changes. So we know that, there's issues around curriculum. We know that there's instances in the classroom where racist and inappropriate comments are made. And I know this from my own research with Indigenous students as well. They talk about the same types of thing. We know that many Indigenous and Black students, other students of color, don't see themselves reflected in the institution at all, in the four walls of the institution. And so they can just rattle these off quite easily. So significant role. And I really do value their voice. So much.
Dr. Smith, thank you.
Thanks for that. So I do believe that, you know, student unions, graduate students associations, also I would say, although they are in between, postdoc offices all have a vital role to play and have been playing it. But I'll also say, to amplify what Dr. Cote-Meeks just highlighted, was that for the longest time, Indigenous students were highlighting the need for mentors and professors that ignited some of the movements around elders and also professorships and spaces, redesigning spaces on campuses. And I would say that broadly speaking, even since the 1990s, when you think of the Guelph's Task Force on Anti-Racism and Race Relations, or the 2008 Canadian Federation of Students final report on campus racism, or the Ryerson Task Force in 2010, and they had an anti-Black racism more recently. All of these were fueled, Brock University, Wilfrid Laurier, all of these anti-racism initiatives across Canadian universities have been fueled by student activists. Following the racial reckoning, spring and summer, you also saw Black Medical Students Association, Black Law Students Associations, Black Arts Students Association, in conjunction with students' unions, also mobilizing and coming out with their own action plans. And that's actually not surprising when you think about the 1960s student uprising. You think about globally, Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, or Rhodes Must Fall at Ariel College, Oxford, or Why Is My Curriculum So White at SOAS, or any of these other places. I Too Am Harvard, I Too Am Dalhousie. All of these initiatives have been mobilized, Black on Campus, Black in the Ivy, mobilized by student activists. Or What Does a Professor Look Like? Hashtag, also by student activists. Or I'm not a mascot, my culture is not a mascot, or something. These are mobilized by communities and students. Still, I think universities are places where students should come to learn, they're leaving home for the first time. These are spaces where they should be enjoying the intellectual life. It's a disproportionate burden to place on students. I mean, I think it's part of life, learning to struggle for what you want. But I actually think, in terms of power, university administrations need to be actually much more mobilized in this role. Faculty, racialized, Indigenous, queer women are largely underrepresented. And so it seems to me, when you look at the power relations within universities, yes, students are carrying the puck, so to speak, but we actually need senior leadership. We actually need board of governors. We actually need senates. We actually need senior administration to be much more engaged in these issues, which means EDI literacy, inclusive leadership, also need to be on the table for change, so that this can happen. But again, I think kudos to the students. Many of us are here because of their activism.
Thank you.
Could I just add, Nicole? Yeah, that's a really great point. And I was reading some of the questions in the Q&A, and it also came up in the Q&A from Ariana. And she talked about that whole need, where students do a lot of the driving of change, but at what expense, in terms of, the burden of responsibility to do that, the exhaustion and so forth. And probably the same could also be said for Indigenous people that are working in the academy, whether they're faculty or staff, or Black faculty and staff, people of color, so forth. There is an incredible burden that's placed upon, I'll use the term BIPOC, because it came up earlier when we were prepping for the panel today, but we have to be careful with that as well, because there has to be some kind of balance in that. And when I'm reminded about that, I'm also reminded about that it's everybody's responsibility to do the work, right? You can't it can't rest solely on the shoulders of students either, or on a particular group of people to mobilize the change. If we're trying to create inclusive communities and inclusive universities, then we're all responsible for doing that work.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a question. Dr. Smith alluded to her colleague, Dr. Michael Hart, in the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, and I know a similar office or role exists at York, and both of you are in the EDI offices as a vice president. I'm just wondering how your work intersects with the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, and where does it diverge and converge? Have you started to see some trends in how you work together, and then how sometimes your work might be a little bit different and distinct?
I could probably start. I did touch a little bit on it in kind of my opening remarks, but I know that some institutions are struggling with this because they don't want to create, say, for instance, another AVP position for Indigenous when there's an AVP of equity. And I think we always have to be reminded about the very distinct identity and place that Indigenous people have in Canada, and their connection to the land. And so it's important for us when we're working in institutions to recognize that. And I mean, probably it's easier for me because I'm Indigenous to say that, right? But I would hope that my colleagues would also think something similar. But there are intersections. There are opportunities to work together and to support one another, because there are some similarities in the struggles that we're experiencing. And so I'll just use the example around racism, for example. Indigenous peoples experience racism every day, whether they're on a university campus or out in society. The same could be said for Black students and Black people in this country, and the way that they're treated. And so there is some similar types of experiences that provide us with kind of a base to understand one another. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I always think too, and this was said to me recently, that when we do work and say, for instance, focus on one specific group, it's also a portal to start making changes with other groups that are systematically disadvantaged in systems. So for instance, when there was a lot of focus on gender, that was actually an opportunity to start looking at all the other groups who are experiencing inequities. It's sad that it took so long, and we're only talking about the intersections and other groups that are experiencing marginalization and oppression and racism and so forth. But those are opportunities to start looking at where our lives intersect as people. Anti-Asian racism existing right now intersects. A lot of I was reminded in a conversation that a lot of Asian people were brought over into the Americas for very specific work, in systems, and to support kind of ongoing colonization. So we do have those opportunities, but I'll circle back now to Indigenous peoples of this land do have a very unique connection to the land because this is their home territory. This is where they were pre-colonization. And what's happened during colonization is, you know, their rights as an indigenous people of the land have been kind of walked all over, if you will, and land has been appropriated. And so, you know, when we talk about decolonization and you hear, you know, the efforts around land back, for example, as a movement, that's all rooted in pieces around decolonization that need to happen. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think that, you know, I was talking to a colleague that works with Malinda, Michael Smith, about Michael Hart, sorry, Michael Smith must be working too close together, Michael Hart, about this. And I think it warrants more discussion and more unpacking. So thanks for the question, Candace.
Thanks so much. Malinda, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, and thanks for the shout out to, again, to my colleague, Dr. Michael Hart, because we do meet regularly and work very hard to facilitate the conversations around intersections and also differences, and to amplify, I think, the work that each of us are doing. So let me say this about, I actually think this is an important question, because it was only a couple of years ago, actually, I started to hear discussions about, well, we can't do anything around anti-Blackness and Black inclusion because we're dealing with Indigenous. I call that a dividing strategy. That's a colonial strategy of divide and conquer, as if to say you can only uplift one, or it's a zero-sum game. And it totally misunderstood what equity is about, but it also misunderstands the question of decolonization. But then it misunderstands questions of justice. That's a terrible thing to say, and it's not zero sum. And the struggles of racism and colonialism, the intersections. So I see here are a couple of intersections I see. Yes, anti-racism. But the multiple ways in which racism intersected with colonialism that impacted Black people from enslavement to the current moment, the way in which it impacted Asians, diverse Asian groups. So despite the myth of the model minority, we also see intensifying racisms against Asians, undifferentiated, which is as racist as you can get. So anti-Chinese racism, but you could be Filipino, you could be Japanese, you could be Korean. In other words, undifferentiated. And then we see the ways racism intersects with misogyny in the recent events in the United States, right? And the way and the sympathy of the institution of policing, the sympathy for the perpetrator. He had a bad day, so he goes out and kills people. I have a bad day, I go for a walk. So the bamboo ceiling. Think about how many people of Asian descent are in university leaderships. That bamboo ceiling is also informed by different kinds of stereotypes about a box that Asians are in, a box for Black people shaped by a tyranny of low expectation, shaped by assumptions of streaming. The streaming starts from K-12 and earlier, right all through the universities. But disaggregated, all the visible or racialized minorities face different kinds of issues. Most of us also have the experience of colonialism. And so it is an interesting intersection about colonialism within Africa or Asia or Latin America, Caribbean, and now being here on, as Dr. Cote-Meeks highlighted, thinking about place, about land, about territories, and about being visitors or being or relationships with Indigenous peoples. This is a vital conversation because if we don't have the conversation shift from European and Indigenous conversations, as most universities have, and the national conversation, to thinking about Indigenous peoples and racialized peoples, for example, or Indigenous peoples and newcomers. If we don't have these conversations, everyone's more likely to reproduce the colonial relationships, the stereotypes, the marginality of Indigenous peoples. So that conversation on the margins is as vital as the margin to the center. And I think that needs to be happening, because when you see these conversations which talk about Indigenous people in relation to Europe, that's not necessarily decentering Europe. It's not necessarily dealing with Eurocentrism. What it's actually trying to do is contain the conversation and the broader need for a decolonizing of the academy, governance and leadership, the structures, the curriculum. The curriculum, we talk about indigenizing the curriculum, we have to decolonize the curriculum, decenter Europe, European centrism. Not to say that we don't exclude Europe, but that Europe becomes one body of knowledge, not the body of knowledge that all disciplines center in the social science and humanities. So I think the relationship is around anti-racism, yes, but also around decolonization and around the idea of of shaping a new decolonial way of being and relationships. And that's actually not easier, because we spend more time on the negation and the unsettling than we do on what would it look like if we took these things seriously. How would our universities be different? How would they be better? What's the vision for not just tinkering on the margins or on the sidelines? What's the vision for something better? Outside the box thinking, blue sky thinking, what does that look like? And how do we chart towards that kind of future? Seems to me that's where we want to go. And I think that's why we need to not get contained in these box conversations, which leads to checkbox responses to anti-racism, decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thank you so much. Certainly more room for more deep conversations about this. I think our time has come to a close. Trying to see where we are at. Dr. Kaniki, do you have any final words before we end the moderation?
Yes, I just want to say a huge thank you to both Dr. Smith and Dr. Cote-Meeks for sharing with our community today. And I know this has gone broader than just the Western University community, and that the conversations in this way are so important to, I think, all of the institutions across Canada, as we're all sort of going through this process right now. So thank you again so much for gracing us with your presence and with your wisdom in this way. And I believe, Candace, we are going to be closing off with our elder Myrna right now. So I'll allow you to introduce Myrna. So.
Okay, so we have Myrna Kicknosway, who is a longstanding elder from Walpole Island, with us today. I can see her on my screen, so I'm just going to signal to her to join us, and she'll just help us close our session off. I want to thank everyone for coming today. We had quite the crowd show up, and clearly this is an important topic for a lot of people across our country in higher education. So thank you for tuning in.
Bonjour, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. I lost you just a few minutes ago. I was listening and then the screen went. This has been very good. It's very exciting that you are talking about these things. And it's about time. Time in a lot of ways. Time is a lot of things to people, different things to others. But we're at the time right now. We're at the spring. The spring equinox just went by us. The time when there was balance between day and night. It's time. It's about time that we start walking on the same path together. Not walking separate paths, but walking together. arm in arm, to resolve all the things that have been put beside the road and not talked about and not envisioned the future, because that's what this is about. There are no accidents here in creation. There are no accidents. There are things that creation is trying to tell us and has been trying to tell us for years and years and years, hundreds of years. It's about relationship. It's about relationship with the land. It's relationship with each other. It's relationship. But it's also responsibility. We are all responsible for this creation, each and every one of us. You can see signs of it with this COVID. The COVID is no accident. It's here to wake us up. Wake up, people. You know, how much food do we have to feed all the people of the world? How much water do the people all have in the world? How many people eat every day? Those are all real things. And it's time to wake up and pick up our responsibilities to move into the future. I really like you two ladies, all the questions and all the comments and the places you went. That just brightens me from the inside out. And that's another point for me. It's the inside out. We were sent here, all of us, different colors of man, to do the work. We have a vessel that we walk around in. And inside that vessel, there are some things that are not very positive about us. Things that have happened to us in the past that we still carry around. And some of the things that are really positive, some of us, but all of that stuff, the positive things sometimes get covered up. And it's time for us to walk with a clean vessel. Take out all of those things that no longer serve us, or things that hold us behind or back from doing things that need to be done for ourselves, our families, and creation especially. It's time, people. It's time to pick up our responsibilities. And that's an inside-out deal for me. So that means individually. We can talk about institutions, we can talk about the country, we can talk about all of those things. But unless you're clean from the inside out, that you have dealt with all of the negativity that's housed inside of you, the future is going to be kind of bleak. But I'm encouraged that you are talking about these things. I see it from a different lens. I see it from a very different lens. And it's a very positive lens that you are sending to us right now. And I say chimigwech to you for that. You've given us all something to talk about and think about and resolve within ourselves, because that's where the resolution starts, within ourselves. Within the institution, it's the individuals in that institution that have the work to do within themselves in order to find those ones, those relationships that will move us collectively into the future. So those are my thoughts at this time, and I'd just like to close us off. And technology is not my friend sometimes, so I missed the beginning. I don't know. Anyway, I think I need to have a tech person with me 24/7 so I know how to work this thing. But let's begin with closing this for the moment, because it is just a moment in our life. So if you could just center yourself and close your eyes and connect with the Spirit as you know the Spirit, because it's for all of us. There's only one Spirit, but we all have a different way of understanding and knowing the Spirit. So I will start off. Abba Jimashomas, Ishkute Makasinque and Yishikaz Mondodem, Bakajanon Dunjaba, Buddha Wadami Odawa and Yishnavi Kwanda, Nisvi Medaman. I say chimigwech you, Kajamnado, for opening up our hearts and our minds and our spirits to do this work. I can see the sun shining across the sky. I can feel the earth filling with joy and life. I know that the grandmother moon who travels across the sky will say, yes, that's where we need to go. And all of those four directions that watch over us, all those Mashom Sug and Nokama Sug that sit in those places and are looking at us today and saying they're getting it. they're getting it. I say chimiigwech to you. So grateful that we could all be here together. Grateful we're talking about relationship. I'm grateful we're talking about the earth, because the earth brings us those things, brings the water we drink, the food we eat, and the air we breathe. We all need to look at what's going on inside of us and asking the Spirit to help us through these next days and moments of our lives, to bring forward, to restore that balance that was here at one time and is trying to be reestablished through the earth. From the sky world to the earth plane to the underground, we ask for that balancing and building that relationship with all that is in this universe. I say chimiigwech to you, safe travels, happy thoughts, happy life, happy spirit. I say chimiigwech to you, Nakanagana, all my relations. Pamampini. Oh.
And miigwech to our esteemed panelists and presenters. We couldn't have had today without your presence, and we just want to thank you again for spending the afternoon with us and sharing all of your insights. We will certainly be taking this away into the work that we're doing here at Western. So miigwech, and everybody have a great day.
Great. Thank you.